Welcome to this revision video on the Americas and Drake's circumnavigation 1577 to 1580. So between the years 1577 and 1580, Francis Drake became the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. This was a really significant historical event which had very important consequences for trade, exploration, and England's relationship with Spain. So here you can see a map showing the route that Drake took, and we're going to be referring to this at regular intervals during this revision video. And this is a really important part of your revision to make sure you're very clear in your head about the route and all the different things that happened on Drake's circumnavigation. Who was Francis Drake? Big picture stuff. Well, he was born in Tavistock, Devon, around about the year 1540. Now, one of the crucial things to know about Drake is that he was of humble origins, the son of a farmer, and we think the eldest of 12 children. Now, from a young age, he lived with his relatives, the Hawkins family in Plymouth in Devon, which was obviously a big port at the time. The Hawkins family were merchants and occasional pirates. And from the age of 18, Drake began to work for the Hawkins family. Now, Drake became a very effective sailor. He worked on ships that were operated by his cousin, John Hawkins, and Hawkins had travelled to places like the Bay of Biscay and the West African coast. Now, Francis Drake would become one of the most famous individuals in the Elizabethan era and probably the most well-known of the English sailors from this era. He also, through his explorations and piracy, became one of the richest men in Elizabethan England. But one of the crucial things to know about Drake is that his low birth meant he was not always well received in Elizabethan England. Drake was and actually still is a very controversial character. To the English, he was a highly skilled maritime leader. To the Spanish, he was known as El Drake, which means the dragon, and he was a feared pirate. Now, opinions about Drake have changed through time as well. At times in history, he has been seen as a heroic adventurer who helped explore the world and achieve great victories against the Spanish. To others, he was nothing but a colonist, pirate, and plunderer. It's important to know that Drake was one of many Elizabethan adventurers, sometimes regarded as colonists, pirates, plunderers. Here is a portrait showing Francis Drake in the centre, with John Hawkins on the left and Thomas Cavendish on the right. There are many other very famous Elizabethan explorers from this time period, people like Humphrey Gilbert and Walter Raleigh, who went west to America, and people like Ralph Fitch and James Lancaster of the East India Company, who went east to explore the India and the East Indies. Now, again, big picture stuff. The reasons for these increase in the voyages of exploration are here and will be helpful if you get a causation question around this. So obviously, England during this time has a huge rivalry with Spain. England wanted to weaken Spain and challenge its power. Spain had lots of gold and silver from its mines in the New World, and Elizabeth's government actually encouraged English sailors to attack and plunder Spanish ships and their territories. Of course, Catholic Spain was a rival, of course, to Protestant England, and that religious dimension is an important aspect of this. Many English nobles invested in the voyages as a way of making money, and we'll find that out today. People like Christopher Hatton. When Drake attacked Spanish ships carrying gold from Mexico and silver from Peru, it brought home huge amounts of treasure. The collapse of the wool and the cloth trade meant that English merchants were now looking for new markets to sell new goods, leading to exploration of this so-called New World. The Elizabethans also sought to spread Protestantism abroad. For example, people like Walter Raleigh set up the Roanoke colony to try and spread Protestant beliefs. Francis Drake himself was a Puritan, and therefore he may well have been religiously motivated. A sense of adventure, books presented explorers such as Drake as dashing heroes. The invention of the printing press enabled more people to find out about the English explorers. Drake would have been famous in the actual time period. And English sailors had been trained, they were well led. Many of them grew up on the coast and became very experienced. People like Drake and Hawkins were successful in leading overseas voyages and inspired loyalty from their crews. In terms of the background to the conflict with Spain, an important element to understand the circumnavigation is to understand the sort of background to the conflict and tensions with Spain. So in 1534, Henry VIII made the break with the Catholic Church and began the Protestant Church in England, and this makes England a potential enemy of Spain, which was Catholic. Now, during the 16th century, Spain was the most powerful country in the world. This was the time period known as the Golden Age of Spain. And English merchants often allied with the French to challenge Spain and its trading monopoly with the Spanish colonies of South America. Now, in 1554, King Philip II of Spain, who is the King of Spain during this time period, during this era, had married Elizabeth's older sister Mary, sometimes known as Bloody Mary, who was queen from 1553 to 1558. Now, when Mary died, Philip had wished to marry Elizabeth, but she had refused. And it's fair to say the relationship between England and Spain during the rule of Elizabeth I was pretty tense. Here shows you a map to show you the extent of the Spanish colonies. Now, one of the significant things to be aware of is down there in South America, these Spanish colonies were in the west, and this was regarded as a place that was quite tricky to get to. And so often these colonies were not particularly well defended because they were kind of defended from the fact that it was really, really difficult to get out there. And that's one of the big significant aspects of Drake's circumnavigation. So let's have a look at the background to Portugal as well during this time, which was also a very important and powerful country, had its own empire abroad, which Spain was eventually colonized during this time period. In 1526, Portuguese sailors had carried the first shipload of African enslaved people to Brazil. The development of sugar and gold mining in the Caribbean brought a demand for labor, and Portugal began to sell enslaved African people to the Spanish colonists in the Caribbean. Now, the slave trade was almost as profitable as the gold trade, and the enslavement of African people, of course, would continue until the 19th century when it was eventually abolished. Now, John Hawkins realized that much money could be made by breaking into this Portuguese trade monopoly of enslaving Africans. So to understand the background of Drake, it's important to understand John Hawkins and the slave trade. So in 1562, John Hawkins set sail for the West African coast. And at Sierra Leone, he stole 300 enslaved people that had already been captured by the Portuguese. And he sailed to the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Here, he exchanged them for cargoes of leather, sugar, ginger, and pearls. This was England's very first involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, in 1564, Hawkins took a larger fleet, and Queen Elizabeth donated a ship to his expedition. The young Francis Drake may well have gone on this voyage as an ordinary sailor, but we don't know for sure. Again, Hawkins raided the West African coast and took 400 Africans captive. Hawkins sold the enslaved people to Spanish colonists, and he would often threaten violence if people did not buy from him. In 1566, Hawkins arranged a third slaving voyage to be led by John Lavelle, who was accompanied by Francis Drake, but this expedition did not make much profit. Between 1562 and 1567, Hawkins made 3 voyages to Guinea and Sierra Leone, and he had enslaved between 1,200 and 1,400 African people. Now, in 1568, Francis Drake became captain of the ship called Judith, or the Judith. It set sail for the Americas with John Hawkins. Hawkins's fleet contained 7 ships, including 2 provided for the Queen. Elizabeth gave instructions to Hawkins. She wanted him to sail to the west coast of Africa, capture Africans, and sell them in the Caribbean. In Sierra Leone, Hawkins and Drake allied with 2 local chiefs called Sherry and Yoma in order to besiege a village which today is near Freetown. The plan was to sell these enslaved people to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. So the result was the capture of 250 men, women, and children, who they added to 250 captives they already had. They set sail for the Caribbean, and after selling some of their slaves, Hawkins' fleet suffered damage in a storm. Now, due to the storm, Hawkins had to anchor in the Spanish port of San Juan de Ulua off the coast of Mexico to resupply and make repairs. Now, this is a crucial event. There, they were attacked by Spanish warships despite having made a truce. Only 2 English ships, those captained by Drake and Hawkins, escaped the attack. Now, this expedition probably made little profit, and it actually put an end to English slave trading for the next 70 years. Some historians say that much treasure made it back to England, as well as many surviving West Africans who began new lives, but some historians argued that they simply lost a fortune. The result, though, was absolutely crucial. It began a switch to raiding Spanish colonies and piracy, and that suited Drake and Hawkins as their experiences made them develop hatred for Spain and desire for revenge. So this event and this defeat is a real causal factor in understanding Drake's actions in the 1570s in terms of attacking Spanish treasure ships and piracy. So Drake returned to the Caribbean in 1570 looking for trade, plunder, and to increase his knowledge of the area. But the most significant thing to know for this time period is that in 1572, Drake went on an expedition to modern-day Panama to a place called Nombre de Dios. Now, Drake had obtained a privateering license from Queen Elizabeth in 1572. This effectively meant that he had a license to plunder and steal from the Spanish. Consequently, he had led a major expedition to the Americas when he planned to attack Nombre de Dios in what we now know as Panama. Now, Drake knew that ships loaded with the gold and silver left the port of Nombre de Dios to return to Spain. Therefore, Drake raided the town and shipping in the area for several months alongside French pirates. They managed to seize vast quantities of gold and treasure. Now, here's a very famous artistic interpretation of Drake in Panama in 1572, and this reflects a very idealized artistic interpretation of Drake. It's produced for a children's storybook in the 1970s, and this time many still regarded Drake as a hero from English history. Now, on this expedition at Nombre de Dios, Drake met Diego, an African who had been enslaved by the Spanish and had connections with the Cimarron. Diego wanted to ally with Drake as he had heard that England was a free land, meaning slavery was not legal on English soil. Now, who were the Cimarrons? Well, the Cimarrons were former enslaved African people who had escaped from their Spanish captors and were living on independent settlements. The Cimarrons were expert scouts who knew the local terrain, landscape, and were really good fighters. Francis Drake took Diego on as a crew member. Diego's knowledge of the local area, language skills, and connections with the Cimarrons proved extremely valuable to Drake. Diego's contacts enabled Drake to ally with the Cimarrons against the Spanish, and this led to Drake being able to capture much gold and silver. Now, Diego actually returned to England with Drake in August 1573. Due to the fact there was a temporary truce with King Philip II of Spain, little was actually made in England about Drake's success in Nombre de Dios. However, the nobility and the Queen were very much aware of Drake's success, and Queen Elizabeth I was eager to finance further expeditions to the Americas. So, what was Drake's plan in terms of his expedition in 1577? Well, what his plan was to explore the Atlantic coast of South America before sailing through the Straits of Magellan and up the Pacific coast to investigate trading, conquest, and settlement in those areas occupied by the Spanish. He was planning to return to England via the same route. Previous English expeditions had to be careful not to upset the Spanish, but now the international situation had changed. Spain was pursuing an aggressive policy towards the Netherlands, and England was seeking new trading markets in South America rather than Central America. Now, what were the Straits of Magellan? Well, if you have a look at that diagram there, the Straits of Magellan are a route from the Pacific Ocean through to the Atlantic Ocean, and they were discovered by Portuguese sailor Ferdinand Magellan. Now, the key point here is that Drake's original plan was never to circumnavigate the world. This happened actually by chance and accident, and we'll find out more as we look at his journey a little bit later on. In terms of preparing for the 1577 expedition, Drake began to turn his attention to the idea of plundering Spanish treasure ships and stealing their cargo, and that would enable the voyages to pay for themselves. Drake was also keen to explore further, and he was intrigued by a so-called Northwest Sea Passage that linked the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that was named the Strait of Anian. This was semi-mythical, and the actual route was not discovered until 1726. It's known as the Bering Strait. Now, in 1576, the English sailor Martin Frobisher had led an expedition backed by Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and Francis Walsingham. He claimed to have discovered it, and Drake may well have wanted to look into this claim. Finding the Northwest Sea Passage was a sped-up travel time between East Asia and Northern Europe, improving trade. So who backed Drake's expedition? Well, it was backed by private investors such as the Hawkins brothers and also leading members of the Privy Council like the Earl of Leicester, Francis Walsingham and Sir Christopher Hatton. Queen Elizabeth put some money in and, crucially, she gave Drake permission. Now, Drake was lead captain for the Hawkins, who had heavily invested in the expedition, and the delicate nature of Anglo-Spanish relations meant royal and noble support could not be given officially for the expedition, which could lead to increased tensions or perhaps even conflict with the Spanish. The investors, interestingly, also had to keep the plan secret from William Cecil, who did not want any kind of conflict with Spain. This meant that Drake's crew were actually told they were traveling to Egypt to collect a cargo of dried fruit, and they were only told the real destination when they were in the mid-Atlantic. Some sailors, obviously, were understandably very angry. So what about Drake's fleet? Well, it's made up of his flagship, the 160-ton Pelican. Now, this was later renamed to the Golden Hind in honor of Sir Christopher Hatton, who's pictured there, one of the sponsors. That's because his family crest was a female deer known as a hind, and you can see his family crest there with a golden hind on the top. Now, the Golden Hind had a crew of around 80 and was accompanied by the 80-ton Elizabeth with a 45-man crew, and the 30-ton Marigold crewed by 25 sailors. There were two smaller supply ships called the Benedict and the Swan, but neither of those completed the circumnavigation. In fact, the only one that completed the circumnavigation was the Golden Hind. Now, early on in the voyage, Drake captured a large Spanish vessel off the coast of Morocco, which he kept and renamed Christopher. He gave its Spanish crew the Benedict so they could return to land. There's a model of the Golden Hind. It was 30 metres long, about 5.5 metres wide. It was not a huge ship, actually, by the standards of the day. Had 3 masts, 7 cannons on each side. It had a crew of about 80, but only Francis Drake had his own cabin. And he was very much the authority on board the Golden Hind. So this map shows Drake's circumnavigation. Remember, it was not his intention to go around the world. Once he had taken all that gold, as we'll find out in the story, he would have to find a new route home. And that's why he ended up traveling across the Pacific Ocean, because he was basically trying to get away from the Spanish. So you can pause that and just have a look at the overview there, and that might be a good thing to come back to later on for yourself as well. So that again shows you the route as it is, and as we're going to find out, because Francis Drake stole loads of Spanish treasure off the sort of west coast of South America, he had to come back a different way home, and in the end, therefore, circumnavigated the world. But that was never, of course, the original intention of his voyage and expedition. So we'll start off by looking at the journey now in detail. So the journey would begin by crossing the Atlantic Ocean, so heading over from Plymouth over to South America. Now, Drake's fleet set off from Plymouth on the 15th of November 1577, but the journey got off to an inauspicious start. A storm forced them back for repairs. It was not until the 13th of December 1577 that the ships set off again. Now, off the west coast of Africa, Drake had a remarkable stroke of good fortune near the Cape Verde Islands. Drake captured a Portuguese ship called the Santa Maria, which he renamed Mary. He took its collection of maps, a rudder, and an astrolabe. Now, a rudder is a book of directions, notes, charts, maps, illustrations, to help sailors. Has details of like tides and shorelines, that type of stuff. Absolutely crucial. It's a key word to know, rudder. And it also had an astrolabe, which is a navigational aid which uses stars and planets for navigation. So Drake took that. Also, crucially, the ship's captain, who was called Nuno da Silva, had huge knowledge of navigation in the Americas and knew where Drake could land and find water. So Drake captured, basically kidnapped Nuno da Silva and took him with him on the journey. The journey across the Atlantic was difficult. Drake's fleet was scattered by storms off the west coast of Brazil. When the fleet gathered back together, Drake decided to sink the Swan and abandoned the Christopher. So he's down to just 3 ships now. Now, the fleet sailed further south along modern-day Argentina, the Bay of San Julian, where Drake spent the winter months waiting for better weather he needed to sail round the bottom of Argentina, which is known as Cape Horn. Now, Drake's relationship with some of the crew and co-commander Thomas Doughty during this time period became difficult. No doubt the tension of having to sort of wait during the winter months. Doughty questioned Drake's authority. They fell out basically, and Drake accused him of mutiny and treason. Now, Doughty was given a trial on board the ship and sentenced to death and beheaded on the 2nd of July 1578. Doughty's brother John accused Drake of acting illegally in executing Thomas, but the case was never proven in court. So as we've seen, by August 1578, Drake's fleet had 3 ships, the Elizabeth, the Marigold, and the Golden Hind. So they set off south for the Strait of Magellan to enter the Pacific. We talked a bit about the Strait of Magellan before, but that red line in the top right-hand corner shows you the route of the Strait of Magellan. It's a route between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean in modern-day Chile and just touches the east coast of Argentina as well. Now, passage through the Strait of Magellan was very quick and only took 16 days in the Pacific. They faced storms and the Golden Hind was blown far south into a vast expanse of ocean. Now, this actually led to the discovery of a wide channel between Cape Horn and Antarctica, which is still known as the Drake Passage today. And you can see that green arrow is just pointing to exactly where that Drake Passage is. The storms took a heavy toll on the rest of Drake's fleet as the smaller ship, the 30-ton Marigold, along with her captain John Thomas and all the crew, was lost in the storms, never seen again. The 80-ton Elizabeth was so badly damaged its captain John Winter was persuaded to give up and head for home, which he eventually did once favourable winds blew. This meant only the Golden Hind was left. So only the Golden Hind was left, but it was seaworthy, well armed, and the Spanish settlements on the Pacific coast were virtually defenceless. The Spanish had believed their remoteness made them completely safe from attack, and this is a really important consequence of Drake's circumnavigation. Drake sailed north along the Pacific coast and he attacked Spanish settlements, ports and towns. He captured Spanish ships at Valparaiso along with their more accurate navigation charts. But not every raid was successful. At Mocha Island, the landing party was attacked by the indigenous Mapuche people who had already resisted the Spanish. Here, both Drake and Diego were badly injured. It was said that Drake had 20 different wounds, and it's thought Diego eventually dies in 1579. It's thought that Diego may have eventually succumbed to his wounds. Now, probably the most significant capture during this time was the lightning raid on Callao, the port of Lima. Drake learned the great Spanish treasure ship, the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, had just set sail for Panama. Drake pursued it, and when he caught up with it, the ship, which was not armed, surrendered with little resistance. The Spanish, of course, were not expecting an attack. They were not expecting Drake or an English sailors to be in those waters. Drake found so much gold and silver on board that it took 6 days to transfer it all to the Golden Hind. It was worth 480 million in today's money. Drake dined with the ship's captured officers, put them ashore, and gave each a gift and a letter of safe conduct. Not all, though, were treated so well. One enslaved African woman called Maria was taken from a Spanish ship in April 1579 off the coast of modern-day Guatemala. She was abused by the crew and became pregnant. Drake abandoned her on a small, heavily wooded island in Indonesia later on in December 1579. Okay, so on to North America. Drake's priority was to get his immense quantity of treasure back to England. He had to resupply the Golden Hind, repair her, and make her watertight again. So Drake headed north to find a safe place for shelter beyond the boundaries of New Spain, heading to modern-day California. Drake came across another Spanish ship which he defeated and from which he took away charts and gained useful information on how to cross the Pacific to the Philippines. Now, English sailors did not know the western coast of North America, but Drake sailed further north than he needed to. He may have been looking for the Strait of Anian. By June 1579, Drake eventually found a natural harbour which he'd been looking for in what is now Northern California. He met the indigenous Miwok people, and it was a friendly encounter, and Drake later renamed the place Nova Albion, New England, and claimed the land for Elizabeth I. This was of no real consequence. Nobody came to settle there, but again, it shows an important consequence in terms of increasing England's knowledge of what is now the west coast of the United States of America. Now, Drake spent several weeks preparing the Golden Hind and chose the Pacific route for the long journey home, setting off on the 23rd of July, 1579. Drake simply could not come back the way he came, for the Spanish could well have tried to take back the treasure. Returning to England, on the way home, Drake bought 6 tons of cloves in the Maluku Islands, the Spice Islands. They were welcomed by the local ruler who wanted to sell spices to English merchants who might compete with his usual Portuguese buyers. This shows an increase in trade was another important consequence. In July 1580, the Golden Hind rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southernmost tip of Africa, and 2 months later, on the 26th of September 1580, Drake finally sailed into Plymouth. He had 59 remaining crew members and a huge cargo of valuable treasure and spices. Now, Drake had been away for nearly 3 years, and this interpretation from Look and Learn magazine suggests Drake returns a hero. But how he was received by the Queen would be crucial to what happened next to Drake. His voyage had certainly added to tensions between England and Spain due to the huge amounts of treasure, gold, and riches that had been taken. When Drake returned, he was informed the Queen was embarrassed and angry, and the Spanish ambassador was asking for compensation. However, Drake soon received a private message from the Queen asking for a private meeting and for samples of the cargo. Subsequently, Drake had a 6-hour meeting with the Queen during which he described the expedition. The Queen approved a report which said Drake had brought home little of value, and Drake was given permission to take £10,000 of gold for himself and share out 40,000 among the crew. The rest of the treasure was stored in the Tower of London. There were 46 parcels of treasure weighing nearly 5 tons. Drake had become one of the richest men in the country. He made regular appearances at court, bought a house in London, but Lord Burleigh refused to do anything with Drake, regarding him as a pirate, and even rejected a gift of 10 gold bars, showing that not everyone accepted Drake. The Queen also allowed him to buy Buckland Abbey in Devon. King Philip II knew of Drake's actions and demanded punishment. Although Elizabeth had pretended to be annoyed with Drake, she actually backed him, welcomed his treasure, and had him knighted on the deck of the Golden Hind, and then there was a ceremony in 1581 as well. This was a huge honour for someone from a fairly humble background. Drake brought glamour and respectability to the role of a sailor. Elizabeth gave the ceremonial sword to knight Drake to the French ambassador so as to involve France in his knighting, a blatant insult to Spain. So in terms of the consequences of Drake's voyage, it showed the vulnerability of Spanish possessions in South America. As a consequence, Philip II of Spain reinforced his territories with more colonists and troops and resulted in an English expedition to South America in the early 1580s failing. It led to English ambitions turning to North America on Walter Raleigh's expedition to Roanoke. Drake's voyage brought back immense wealth and gave the Spanish a huge shock in an area of the world where they thought themselves to be untouchable. Drake explored and made important geographical discoveries in areas previously unknown to Europeans. Drake was the first Englishman to complete the circumnavigation of the globe. The Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan was the first, but he had died on the voyage. Drake made new discoveries that were previously unknown to Europeans. He found a new route to the Pacific, which is still known as the Drake Passage. He was the first European to explore discovered land on the far northwest coast of the Americas, which he named Nova Albion. He made new maps, such as more accurately mapping Chile. In the East Indies, Drake was the first European to chart and navigate the south coast of Java, landing at the port of Tilgetap. Drake also kept really accurate records of the journey. His diary and his journal of the voyage included both illustrations and maps. Remember those rutters? Others on board also kept records, such as his young cousin John Drake. Now, sailors often used guidebooks called rutters to guide them when at sea. They included views, maps, and information about current, water depth, and potential danger. The Spanish used rutters, and they were regarded as highly secret documents. Therefore, Drake's use of rutters was a key consequence in enabling and opening up further exploration. Drake's voyages were kept secret in England, so only the Queen, her ministers, and inner circle were allowed to know of it. The Queen was anxious to keep news of the voyages secret, as it gained the crown 10 tons of silver as well as gold and other treasures. Drake, though, inspired other explorers, such as by October 1580, a new expedition was already being planned to exploit knowledge gained. As Drake had captured many navigation instruments and maps, English knowledge increased greatly. By 1584, English explorer Walter Raleigh was planning a colony in North America, no doubt inspired by Drake. The Spanish ambassador was said to have reported, "There is hardly an Englishman who is not talking of joining the voyage." So encouraged are they by Drake's return. This jewel, known as the Drake Jewel, was given to Sir Francis Drake by Queen Elizabeth I to show her gratitude in 1588. The portrait of 1591 of Francis Drake by Marcus Gerhardt the Younger shows him wearing it. The Drake Jewel is a pendant, the lid of which has the bust of a black man superimposed on a white figure. Inside is a miniature of Elizabeth I by Nicholas Hilliard, the well-known producer of miniatures during this time period, with a phoenix on the reverse. Historian Miranda Kaufman interprets it as, in light of what we know of Drake's alliance with the Cimarrons, a new interpretation emerges. The black and white bust symbolise how the forces of Englishmen and Africans united are powerful enough to liberate the world from the power of Spain. So that was a revision video about the Americas and Drake's circumnavigation from 1577 to 1580. Hope you found that useful. Bye-bye.